we also try to see that there are new challenges which are coming up, especially when we try to see with regard to the Indian society. We try to find out that many things are there which are seen as the uncovered histories, and they are to be what I can say, seen in the new light, or they are to be rediscovered in that sense as such. And that is how we try to see, and keeping that particular thing in mind, we have a prominent perspective which can be thought of as an important aspect of Indian society, especially in the field of sociology. We try to see that feminist perspective plays a crucial role, and the feminist perspective, we try to say that this perspective is not to be seen in what I can say, a specific discipline framework. Rather, it has to be seen across the discipline, because the feminine concern is something which is what I can say, to be seen as part and parcel of society, and should not be restricted to the specific discipline. Now, somehow we try to see the feminine perspective in the general sciences also, but also we will have the way in which we can see the sociology of gender, especially in the framework of feminist perspective. So, the first thing that we have to really see is to have the understanding of the meaning of feminine perspective as such, and also means the concept which is involved, what is the meaning of feminism in that sense as such, and then we try to see the trends which are part of the feminist perspective. And the third thing which we will try to focus upon is basically the contribution by the people in the field of feminist perspective, and here we try to see basically the contribution of Sharmila Rege, and Sharmila Rege's contribution can be seen focused in terms of feminist perspective in a sociological framework. That is why I am trying to touch upon this particular issue. But beyond that, we have many other scholars who can be rated in the field of feminist perspective, like we have Gail Omwet, then we have Beena Agrawal, that is fields of one's own, and we also have many other scholars in the field of feminist perspective which tries to understand this particular issue in a specific framework. But before beginning this perspective in a specific way, let us try to see what this particular issue is. Basically, when we try to speak about the feminist perspective, we somewhere try to have the understanding with regard to the relationship between the women and society. I think that is how we try to see this particular issue, that it is basically seen as the link between the women and the society, and how it has been distorted, how it has been framed, or how it has been put into the academic front. Especially somewhere we try to see that there is certain amount of exclusion which takes place with regard to the women's voice. Somewhere we are trying to see that women's space is being neglected, and sometimes we try to see that the women's voice has not been put much weight, especially when we try to see it in terms of participation. So, we can have the various ways in which we can see this particular issue within the feminist perspective, and it is an activist approach that sees the inequality as a systematic wrong that must be challenged. So, virtually the feminist perspective believes on the fact that it has certain amount of radicalism, and this radicalism is basically against the existing inequality in the society, especially the society which was at the wrong end, and it has to be challenged. So, in that way we try to see that the feminist perspective is seen as what I can say, the voice, the the silent voice which are now going to be more vibrant, visible in the public sphere, and also which can even have the capacity to challenge the existing or the hegemonic voices. And today's feminist theory is used to explain the inequality in the main social institutions. Especially its concern is that how explicitly dealing with the gender has to be seen in a sensitive way, because somewhere we try to find out that the institutions which are to be seen as the public entity, but they also are gender specific. So, how we can see these social institutions, the prevalence of inequality or the amount of expression of the voices of the gender in a specific way, I think these are the things which the feminist perspective deals with. And we also have what you can say can locate the feminist theory which tries to agree and disagrees on many issues in that sense as such, which we try to see. Basically, we try to see that it is an advocacy of social equality. I think this is how we can focus upon the feminist perspective, that it is basically an advocacy for equality. Now, this advocacy for equality is basically between the women and men. So, the advocacy for equality between the women and men, and also it is in opposition to patriarchy, the patriarchal values, and also in opposition to the sexism. So, we have the issue of feminist perspective in opposition to patriarchy and also against the sexism in that sense as such. That is how we can build up our understanding about the feminist perspective. Now, one thing that is clear, that it is basically working for what? It is basically working to increase the equality, working towards equality. That of course is one strong thing which we can derive when we try to speak about the feminist perspective. Then another important thing that we can raise is basically we can have the understanding in terms of expansion of human choice. Expansion of the human choice, that is another important aspect, that we should not have a single way of looking to the things. We does not believe in alternatives, that should be avoided in that sense as well. Rather, there are possibilities of alternatives that one has to keep in mind. Then another significant thing which sociologically proper, if you try to see, that it basically tries to eliminate the gender stratification. So, it tries to eliminate the gender stratification, that is another way in which we can look into the issue. Then also we try to see that it is meant for ending up the issue of the sexual violence. That is another important aspect that we try to see with regard to the feminist perspective. And finally, we try to see that it is basically working for the issue that to promote the sexual freedom, promoting the sexual freedom. Now, these are the ways in which, or these are the different aspects which can be thought of when we are trying to speak about the issue of feminism in general as such. And I think when we try to speak about these issues, one thing that comes out of course is that feminist does not believe on the biological based inequalities. As we all know that we have two forms of inequalities. One of course is the biological based inequalities, and another of course is the social based inequalities. Biological, we have many things which we can speak about, like we have the issue of age, we can have the issue of the race, we can have the issue of speaking about what you can say, the so called what you can say, intelligence in that sense as such, the IQ in that sense as such, and many other things which are part of the biological based differences. And these biological based differences can be seen as some aspect of inequality. Similarly, the male and the female is basically to be seen in terms of the biological entity. But the problem comes when we try to speak about the social based inequality. The social based inequality tries to focus upon that how the society constructs the inequality or how it promotes the inequality as such, and that is where we have to see that when we try to speak about the gender is to be seen as a neutral entity, because we try to see that gender is both masculine and feminine, but and that has to be seen in terms of the biological entities. But when we try to see it in terms of implications or in terms of the projections, then we try to see that okay, this is male, this is female, and accordingly the jobs, the division of labor, the understanding, the space, everything has to be given in that particular fashion. And who decides that? It's basically the society, the social structure, and the institutions which tries to give the space to the two genders in that sense as such. So, in that way we try to see that the biological based differences sometimes are speeded up or sometimes they are been galvanized with the presence of the social based aspect in that sense as such. And in that way we can have that this feminist perspective tries to bridge up this gap, the gap between the men and the women. That is what we said is to move towards the equality as such. And this equality are to be seen in various aspects. We have to see the equality in the political sphere, especially in terms of political representation. We have to see it in economic sphere, basically where we have the equal wages, equal employment, or we try to speak about not the gender specific jobs and other things as such. And similarly we also try to see that it has to be seen in the social context also, where social context is to be seen as that why there should be the segregation, the separate division of labor, the what you can say, the voices for few and not for others, or maybe even the food habits, many other things are there which are part of our social and which tries to construct the gender in a very specific fashion. But this feminist perspective, if we try to see, we can, it's not that feminist perspective is to be seen in one broader parameter. Rather, the feminism has various types, and the different types if we try to see, one of course is the liberal feminism. We have the liberal feminism, that is this feminism or this school of thought basically believes on the fact that, so these are basically the types of the feminist perspective. One of feminism in that sense. So, we have the liberal feminism which says that everybody is free to develop their own talent and interest, meaning thereby that they try to have that environment which is quite natural, open in that sense as such. It is something which is going to be free from any bias in that sense as such. Whosoever have the talent or the skills, they can excel irrespective of what is the gender, what is the biology behind that as such. So, the liberal feminism are not that radical feminism, but they simply try to say that the talent, the skills or the interest, they are to be put open, and depending upon the nature of the person here is either male or female, and they should be given the opportunity in that sense. The second prominent type which we can see is the socialist feminism. Socialist feminism, if you try to see, it tries to have the issue of collective personal, it has to have the collective personal liberation, and this we try to see more in terms of what you can say that collectivity has to be represented. It's not that individual are or the individual women's are to be seen as the target and then they have to be elevated in that sense. As that we are talking about in the socialist feminism, that we have the collective liberation which are to be seen on the various grounds, and this collective liberation are to be seen as that everybody is open in that sense, as a society is such that where we have the space for all, and in that fashion if we try to see that the socialist is also trying to make an appeal that the state does not have any amount of sponsorship or maybe the reservations or restrictions for the specific gender, and in that way the socialistic feminism is believing on the fact that everybody has to be elevated and liberated in that sense as such. Then the third is the radical feminism. Radical feminism. Now, radical feminism basically, it on the first hand it tries to eliminate the idea of gender. I think this is something which is to be seen in a very distinctive way, that the idea of gender has to be minimized or just lessened or just removed in that sense as such, and that of course is how we try to see the radical feminism in that sense as such, just overthrowing or just trying to move out from the issue of gender in that sense as such. So the whole notion of gender has to be moved off, and we try to see it more in terms of that everybody is equal irrespective of what the gender is, and the understanding of gender itself is going to be evaporated in that sense as such. And apart from that, it basically tries to have the gender free what I can say revolutions, gender free revolutions, which are to be seen more in terms of the fact that anybody has the capacity to move ahead can or should be allowed in that sense as such. So it believes in the egalitarianism. It believes in the egalitarianism with the fact that we have the gender free revolution, where it is that when we try to speak about the radical feminism, the idea of gender has to be minimized in that sense as such. And then we have the another type, that is opposition to the feminism in that sense as such. In opposition to the feminism, now this is basically seen as the threat to the male status. It is basically seen as a threat to the male status, and also going to an extent of even their self respect. So it is one can say that this can be seen as the hard form of radical, what one can say the ultra radicalism. Sometimes we can have another term, ultra radicalism in that sense as such, the extreme radicalism. We can have parallel terms in that sense as such, extreme radicalism or the ultra radicalism, which is trying to have the fact that there is a threat to the male status or even their self respect, and there is always, we try to see that the female which should act differently in that sense as such. And if you try to see, I think every society in the various nations, they can have either of the way, they can have the mixed way also, they have the combinations in that sense as such. But the important thing in that sense of course is that there are certain amount of what I can say prominent or the manifested aspect which are visible in the different societies. But more than that, the important thing in that sense of course is that the feminism is an issue of concern to any and every society. Now if we try to see the ways in which we can represent or we can understand these issues, we can have the different perspectives in which we can approach the feminism itself. But if we try to see how feminism has emerged as an important debate, I think when we try to speak about that, we try to speak about the period in terms of 1970s, where we have the understanding of the feminist issues in that sense as such, which becomes more seasoned, settled, and also debatable in that sense as such. And in India, basically, when we try to see that in 1970s, we have seen the debates to be very crucial. We have various scholars, the feminist scholars in that sense as such, like if we try to name some, we have this Neera Desai, which was trying to talk about this issue of gender in a specific way. We have Maitri Krishnaraj, which is again seen as a symbol of the feminist scholar in that sense as such. We have Iravati Karve, which has significant contribution in the field of kinship organization in India. We have also Veena Mazumdar, which was basically trying to speak about the field of one's own in an economic framework, that is the land rights to the women in India. And apart from that, we have the people like Leela Dubey, who try to speak about the gender in relation to the kinship, that is talking about the matrilineal with regard to the kinship pattern in that sense as such, matrilineal and kinship, what is the relationship between them. Then also we have Karuna Chanana, and Karuna Chanana's contribution is seen significantly in the field of gender, especially when we try to see that Karuna Chanana is trying to make out that how the feminine is going to be represented in the case of higher education or the education system in India. And in one of her work, she is trying to represent that how in the higher education, especially in universities and colleges, we have the specific form of hierarchy. Like we have the hierarchy of discipline for women, that is like arts for women, education for women in that sense as such, music or sometimes literature is for women. But when it comes down to the science and commerce, gradually we try to find out that lesser women are there as student and scholar in that particular field. Similarly, she also had spoken about or given the factual understanding. She has basically analyzed this UGC 9th and 10th document on higher education, and there she is trying to highlight that how in the various universities and colleges the representation of women as faculty is very meager. And apart from that, if you try to see it not as a women, if you try to have a microscopic understanding, we try to find out that if we have the segregation of women as SCs, STs and OBCs and other categories, then their representation in each category is going to be very minimal in that sense. So we try to see that we have not only the hierarchy of the discipline for the women, also we have the so-called, even in the so-called what you can say service sector also, we have the limited female faculties which are going to be represented. So that is what Karuna Chanana has seen women as exclusionary categories in terms of understanding their representation. And apart from that, we also try to see the contribution of Naila Kabir. Then we have the contribution of what you can say speaking about certain other specific works, like what is patriarchy by Kamla Bhasin. What is patriarchy, and many other significant works are there, and these works were basically trying to see the representation of women in a specific institution or across the institutions in that sense as such, and how they have been represented through history. Now, apart from these studies or from these works, certain other women's which are significantly speaking about the representation of women's, like we have Professor Susi Tharu, and then we have Professor like Vandana Shiva, they are more seen with regard to the environmental issues in that sense as such. And these works, if you try to see the contribution made by these scholars, so they had got what you can say, their motivations and understanding from the specific contribution from a very significant work. We have a very important book, that is The Second Sex. And this is seen as one of a prominent contribution by Simone de Beauvoir. Simone de Beauvoir's contribution, The Second Sex, which basically speaks about that how the women are treated differently in a specific society. And this work of course is seen as a very significant work, because it tries to speak about the understanding of a gender in a very specific way. And this was also seen as one of the source of motivation, and also trying to see that how women are being represented across the time. Now, this is of course one side of the story about speaking about how we can locate or understand the feminist aspect. We also have within the feminist perspective the various ways in which we try to see the debate took place. Like if we try to see the feminist perspective in the structural functional framework, we try to find out that the structural functional framework tries to see that what women are doing, they are doing for maintaining the order and stability in the society. Like we have Talcott Parsons' contribution, who tries to see that how that role specific jobs are going to bring about the equilibrium in the society. Or we try to see that what women does in terms of division of labor, that is going to be significant for that particular aspect for maintaining of the order and stability. Like one thing which Parsons says, that socialization and the roles which are being performed by the women are going to integrate them and also integrate the society in a wider way. So virtually we have one way of looking to the issue of feminine from the structural functional viewpoint. Then we can also speak about the conflict perspective. Conflict perspective, which basically tries to deal with the fact that how women are to be seen as part of the production system. And here the conflict perspective, if you try to see the issues, we try to find out that it is basically with the advent of capitalism, the women's were put at what you can say as certain restrictions and the barriers. Because if you try to see historically speaking, then the women's, when they were the food gatherers and the hunters, when they were part of the initial life, the ancient society and ancient life, then their say and their freedom was multiple in that sense. Like they were seen as good hunters, they were seen as the good cultivators, they were seen as the good preserver of the food and many other things as such. So in that way we try to find out that in the framework of the development, especially if you try to have that Marxian way of looking to the society, then we try to see that in the initial stage in the ancient society we have more freedom for the women. But as we move towards the capitalism, especially with the advent of the state, we have developed certain restrictions for women. And state, which is basically seen as having a patriarchal aspect, state which has been seen as how it has certain amount of male domination in that sense, as a protector and as a dictator, as a instructor to the members in that sense as such. And that is how we try to see that with the advent of the state and the capitalism, we have that the restrictions started coming up on the women. Like we try to see in the case of industrial setting, the working hours were fixed, that in the night shifts or in the late nights, the women are not allowed to work in the industries. So virtually the women which were having the freedom to work at any period of time because of the industrial laws, because of what you can say, the implementation of the policies of the state, there were certain amount of restrictions which has been developed and which tries to restrict the mobility and the freedom of women. Then we also try to see that with the advent of what I can say, the development, we find out that specific jobs or the specific division of labor was been assigned to the women as such. So the public sphere, which was been seen as an open sphere for the women in the previous era, but now they were been restricted to the private sphere. So we try to find out that as the development proceeds, the women's were been put to the private sphere. So the public sphere was been restricted for the women and the private sphere was been made for them, and that speaks about that either we can say that the development is going to be adverse for the women in terms of their freedom, in terms of their what you can say, hegemony, or not hegemony, but in terms of their what you can say, or having certain amount of participation. So that has been restricted in that sense as such, and gradually it has led to what I can say, their decline from the production system. So this, with the decline of that, definitely it has led to certain conflicting interest. Who is going to be the controller of the property, or who is going to be the money maker in that sense as such. So all these things have gradually been taken off from the women and has been put into the hands of the male. So we see that there is a Marxian way of looking to the whole notion of the feminist perspective, and also we have the interactionist approach. The interactionist approach, which tries to have the study of the women at the micro level, especially trying to see their everyday behavior. We try to see that how the change topic of conversations are there in that sense as such, how ignored topics are chosen by the women in that sense as such, how to minimize the idea of women in that sense, or how to interrupt the women. Now these are certain things which the men like to do for the women in that sense as such, that when the interaction is taking place, then how men is going to deal with the women in that sense. Either suddenly the topic may change, sometimes ignoring certain topics in that sense as such. Sometimes we try to see that in the interaction they are being interrupted in that sense as such. So this is also the way in which we can understand this feminist perspective, that trying to see the behavior and the activities of women during the interaction in that sense as such. So we can have the interactionist approach also for looking to the feminist perspective, especially when we try to see the contribution of Mead. Mead was basically speaking about the tribal society. One society which has been talked about by Mead was the Arapash, which was basically having that both and male and the females were taught to be expressive. So it was having the issue of expression which was being open for both male and female. That was the society, type of society in the tribal society, the stage in that sense as well. Then you have the second thing, that is Mandu-Gilmore. Mandu-Gilmore basically where both genders were taught to be masculine. Both the genders have to be masculine in that sense as well. That is, irrespective of that one is male or female, we try to see that the masculine character is developed in both of them in that sense as well. So that is the second level of tribal society which we can speak about. The third, which is been talked about by Mead, is Tekaboli. Now Tekaboli, if you try to see, we try to see that here the society is to be seen from the Western standards, and the basic idea in that sense of course is that male and the female are seen in the opposite roles, like the males are to be seen in terms of feminine and the females are to be seen in terms of masculine. So, trying to interchange the understanding of the gender sensitivity in that sense as such. Now, we have the three cases. One of course is open for both. In one case, we are trying to have the masculine character, that is the dominant character in both the genders in that sense as such, and in the third case we are trying to just reverse the understanding of the masculine and the feminine. So, this is the thing which can be visible through the interaction in that sense as such. So, Mead was trying to speak about the fact that when we try to speak about the interaction between the men and the women, we can see these aspects which can be seen visible during the process of interaction. And we also try to find out that these aspects are also to be seen in terms of like when we try to speak about the tribal society, can we say that the tribal society was more advanced? And here of course I was just wanted to say one more thing, like we all know that when we try to speak about the tribal society, one important thing that was there, that is the issue of the bride price. And in the case of the rural and the urban society, in the rural and the urban society, we have the phenomenon which we try to see in terms of the dowry. Now, if you try to see both the things as such, the tribal society which is considered to be less developed or inferior in that sense as such, and there we have the bride price. And the case of bride price, if we know, and that we know also that the bride price is what, where the husband's party has to give a token amount to the girl's party in that sense as such. So, the male party has to give an amount or a booty to the girl's side in that sense as such, and which is basically seen as a symbol that the women was the part of the division of labor, she was into the production system, but since that production system has been taken off, so the male party is going to provide certain compensation. So, it speaks about the fact that the women's status, their role in their own family is been represented and also is been considered, and the other party, the male party, when they are taking up that particular what you can say support, so they are repaying also, and that basically speaks about the superior status of women, because we try to see that the women are not being paid, rather they are being paid because of their contribution to the family, to the field or whatsoever activities they were doing. On the contrary, if you try to see the phenomena of dowry, the dowry is basically seen as the girl party is giving certain gifts and the amount to the male party in that sense as such. Now, if we try to see this shift which is taking place, that the tribal society, the respect for the women was more, the respect or dignity, or one can say their contribution was been recognized in that sense as such, and that has been duly compensated. But when we try to see the urbanization, the development of the society, the settlement as such, so then we try to find out that the women are the victim of these particular issue, like we have these notions of the dowry deaths and the killings and all that as such in the name of dowry. So, we try to see that the development has led to the restrictions or the downfall of the status of the women in general as such. But again it has to be seen contextually, because many times we try to find out that in certain tribal societies we always have this phenomenon of purchasing women also, that was also there in that sense as such. There was also the marriage which was by trials in that sense as such, and many other things were there in that sense as such. So, it is not a question of uniformity, but certain amount of practices which have been there, which have been part of the tribal societies, but how through time it can lead to some other form. Now, coming down to the specific contribution, and here of course the contribution which we are trying to make out is the contribution by Sharmila Rege. And as we said that Sharmila Rege's contribution is going to be significant, because she has been seen as the second generation of feminism in that sense as such. Second generation of feminism which tries to work upon and contribute towards the conditioning and the understanding of the feminine in that sense as such, and trying to see the gender categories across the various cultures, religion, caste, class and the communities. To say a brief about Sharmila Rege, we can say that she was born in the Kolhapur district 1964 and brought up at Pune, where she has an education from Ferguson College and the Department of Sociology, University of Pune, and since 1991 she was the lecturer at Kranti Jyoti Savitri Phule Women's Study Center and later on part of this Department of Sociology. And her contribution definitely Sharmila Rege is no more, but her contribution was quite significant, especially we try to see that she was been a celebrated professor at the Department of Sociology, University of Pune. She was also associated with the Indian Institute of Technology, Mumbai for a shorter period of time as professor over there. In that sense, she has received the Malcolm Adishia Award for the distinguished contribution in the development studies by the MIDS, that is Madras Institute of Development Studies, in 2006, and also she has been honored with various prestigious positions, honorary director to the Women's Study Centers, part of the various committees as such, and her concern was to work for or to work in the interest of women. She has published a lot in the field of gender and sociology, Dalit feminism, and also the social history of the popular culture practices, especially in Marathi and English. And also our contribution is significant in a sense that it basically tries to have everyday understanding about the women's life. And within that framework, I think if you try to see one of her important edited work, that of course is the Sociology of Gender. Sociology of Gender, which basically is the challenges of the feminist sociological thought. It was from the Sage publication which came in 2003, and another important work that we can talk about with regard to Sharmila Rege's contribution is Writing Caste, Writing Gender. Writing Caste, Writing Gender. That was another important contribution by her. And then we have the readings of Dalit women's testimonies, reading of Dalit women's testimonies. That was another significant work that we can speak about. And also she has written on Ambedkar's writing on Brahminical patriarchy, that has been part from this Navayana publications. Now if you try to see out of many of our work, the prominent work of Sociology of Gender, I think it speaks about the understanding of gender from a sociological viewpoint. And what she says that Sociology of Gender to Rege is one which is constantly been confronted when we try to question upon the location of sociology of women and gender. We try to find out that they have been at the periphery or at the margin of the academic borderland of sociology. So even the discipline, if you try to see, we try to find out that their voices, their representations, their understanding, they have been basically seen as what I can say at the margin, in a sense that it also has a patriarchal appeal. And in that way, even if you try to see that the discipline itself has been genderized or biased, then what can be the possible outcome one can understand. Especially she tried to identify that the important contributions in the field of Indian sociology, if you try to see, they do not want to accommodate the feminist contributions. That was one strong objection that she was trying to make out, that the feminine contributions are not being taken up seriously or accommodated, and for that she wanted to have certain amount of inclusion, which she tried to see in three broader categories. She wanted the inclusion of the issues related to the women in that sense as such. Then second thing in that sense of course is certain amount of separatism that has to be visible in that sense as such. And the third thing which she is trying to focus upon is the issue of reconceptualization. So, the inclusion of the women in the academia, in their contribution in that sense as such, basically which is to be seen in terms of not only the inclusion in a simple sense, rather it has to be seen in a radical way in which their voices are to be seen in a very strict and a serious manner in that sense as such. Then the issue of separatism which has to be seen in connection with the fact that the separatism is basically trying to have the gendered identity in that sense as such. Means it is not simply projecting the things on a commonality, rather it has to be seen in terms of the amount of distinctiveness in that sense as such. And the third thing which of course happens to be again important is the sort of reconceptualization. Now this reconceptualization, if you try to see, the reconceptualization is related to the fact that how we have to have the new terms which have to have certain amount of gender sensitivity in that sense as such. So, the reconceptualization itself requires that the concepts were not properly defined or understood, rather they are understood in a specific patriarchal sense. So, they have also to be dismantled, and we have to have the concept which has to have an intensity and an appeal for both the sexes in that sense as such. And apart from that, she also is having certain amount of pedagogical implications which needs the specific attention. While debating upon the space to be given to the gender in sociology, she was basically saying that the sociology of gender has to be allowed, which is to be allowed in terms of organic linkage. Especially we try to see that there should be the sociological curriculum where we have the engendering in sociology that should be debated out, engendering in sociology that is to be seen in that sense as such. And also we try to see that Breguet tries to have certain amount of pre-institutionalization phase of sociology, pre-institutionalization of pre-institutionalization phase of sociology. That is one thing which is trying to be seen, that we try to find out that this was the time or this was an era where the women's were not been represented much, their voices or their contributions have not been significantly seen. Then we also have the institutionalized phase of sociology, the institutionalized phase of sociology. Now this institutionalized phase of sociology is yet to have the full recognition, because it has started, it has to come up in that sense as such, where the scholarship generated by the various development processes should incorporate the spirit of women in that sense as such. It tries to raise the issues of the margin itself, the periphery and the center, without diverting the focus of the gender. Means the margins are to be re-understood, the center has to be re-understood, but again it does not mean that periphery should come to the center, rather the periphery which has been understood prior, that has to be seen differently as such. That is how we try to see we can work upon these issues, like the new frontiers of sociologies are to be opened, which try to cater upon the representation of the women in a specific sense. The contribution which is visible in this sociology of gender, it basically tries to have the new thought processes in that sense, the new sociological thoughts which have to emerge. Like we talk about certain names which figured well when we try to see this origin of sociology in India, Iravati Karve, and apart from that we don't have many important contributions which can be seen as the leading figures which has trying to give the direction to the whole notion of the development for the women's representation in sociology. And now we try to see that Sharmila Rodriguez's contribution for developing this sociology of gender has basically led to the new way of looking to the sociology as a discipline. And it is not only that, rather many new scholars that have come into prominence which tries to work upon, or which tries to speak about that women are to be represented in a specific way. Like we have very significant contributions which are coming up in the contemporary Indian writings in that sense. As such, I think Professor Sujata Patel's contribution definitely, and her representation as the president of the Indian Sociological Society, that is definitely a remarkable phase of the development and the presence of the women in the national and the international framework. And beyond that, we also try to see that the women's, when they are occupying the specific positions, academic positions, definitely it will have certain concern for writings and the development of the sociology in a specific framework, and that has to be seen in that particular light. And we try to see this whole notion of feminism in India. We try to have the new set of movements which are coming up, especially we try to have various socio-cultural, political and the economic movements which tries to give the equal opportunities for women in India. In that sense, as such, there was a plea for what I can say, the equal wages, gender equality in that sense, as such, equal work, right to work, and also the equal wages. We have the right to access to the health and the education system, the equal rights for the political participations. So these are certain things which are to be seen as the what I can say, the spaces which are to be filled up with the presence of women. The Indian feminists also have fought against their own culture. Sometimes when we have the fight against others, it is easy to fight, but when we have to fight with ourselves, with our own, then the fight becomes troublesome, because then how we have to catch hold of our oppositions, that is going to be an important issue. Like historically speaking, we have India's patriarchal society where the prevalence of the sati pratha, we have the widow what I can say, putting up as a stigma in that sense. As such, we also try to find out that the earlier India, which has lesser role of the women in general. Like many times it has been questioned and it has been raised also that how many women were being part of the India's freedom struggle, and sometimes it has been said that as if it was the male alone which has given rise to the freedom of the Indian society. But on the contrary, we try to see that there is also the contribution of the women with regard to the freedom struggle, but their representation or their concern or their attempts for reforming and also for freeing India, that is not taken up in a broader panorama. So virtually we have to see that how the space, the public space, has to be not only re-understood, rather it has to be reconstructed in that sense, as such, which can have a better appeal, where we will have the opportunities for equal representation, and their justification should also be considered, so that we can have a better understanding about the Indian society. But we also try to find out that various Indian feminist movement which are still live, which basically speaks about the inequality and discriminations, are also present. Especially we try to see the social exclusion which is to be seen was been part of the Indian patriarchal culture, and basically the right over the land ownership is still prevailing as such. Like we try to see that on the one hand the law permits that we have the land rights which are to be given to the daughters in that sense as such, but how many times the daughters are going to have their claim of that particular property. Same is the case with the access to education. Like we try to speak about the fact that access to education has been done by the right to education, and also by this the schemes which are being run especially by the government of India. But if you try to see in terms of distribution, we try to find out the distinction which is being based on that the girl child is more seen and visible in the public schools, but the boy is being put into the private. So it's not the question of education alone, even the quality of education also, it's not the access to education, rather the quality of access to education also has to be seen in a specific framework. And also we try to see that the new phenomenon which are coming up is with regard to the new policies, either it's the question of the understanding of the women as an honor killing in that sense as such, or we try to see the sex selective abortions which are taking place. All these things basically try to speak about the fact that still in the Indian societies there are many issues which have certain amount of gender specific concern. The only thing which we have to do, of course, is that we have to have certain amount of separatism which has been pointed out by Sharmila Rege, that what is the not the uniqueness, but what is required, that women has to be treated differently or has to be seen in a separate domain. That is how we have to really see the things. As if when we try to speak about the notion of inclusion, inclusion does not mean that simply for the namesake they are to be incorporated. Like we try to see in many cases that 73rd amendment has been implemented where the women are been representing the panchayats, but if you try to see on the factual notion, we try to find out that many times women are not taking up that particular job in a serious way, or they are being guided by the male part, or sometimes they are seen as the dummies in the name of the male. So if this is the concern of representation, then I think this sort of inclusion are to be avoided. What is required more in that sense, of course, is that inclusion has to be in a dignified way in terms of an attempt to what you can say retain the presence of women with all dignity and respect. And also as we discussed that radical feminism is required, but radical feminism, if the society itself is taking care of the measures, then I think there is no need for such radical feminism. If we have definitely the exchange of the roles, or sometimes if we try to see that the whole notion of the joint family which has the patriarchal aspect is being seen in terms of the equal representation for the women also, then these questions may not arise. Like the reconceptualization which we are speaking about, the reconceptualization of the Indian joint family has to be seen not simply in terms of the patriarchal head, rather it has to be seen as in either way, patriarchal or the matriarchal head. Like we have the matrilineal which has been part of our society in specific cultures also, where we see that the women are the controller of the property and the other issues in that sense as well. So it does not say, or that it does not mean that the Indian culture does not have that capacity to accommodate and represent the women. The only thing, of course, is that spread effect should have certain amount of uniformity. If we maintain that uniformity, then it can have the better representation of the women as such. Now the point, of course, is that if these issues are taken up seriously, then the whole notion of injustice against the women, or maybe the reservations for women are not needed in that sense as such, and that will lead to the healthy development of society. So with these words we can put up an end to this particular understanding, and we will have interaction and further learnings in some other deliberations accordingly. Thank you.